Welcome to this UCL lunch hour lecture on ethnic and racial disproportionality in police use of Taser. My name is Jyoti Belur, and I'm Professor of Policing at the Department of Security and Crime Science, University College London. I will be chairing today's session, and it is my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Ben Bradford. Ben is a Professor of Global City Policing at UCL and Director of the Center for Global City Policing at the Department of Security and Crime Science. Ben's research interests include public trust, police legitimacy, cooperation and compliance in justice settings, organizational justice, and ethnic and other disparities in policing, some of which he'll be sharing with us in this lunch hour lecture. He has numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, chapters, and has co-edited several collections. He's prolifically cited and is a global expert in his field. He has collaborated with various police forces, as he will tell us in his talk. But before I hand over to Ben, I just want to let you know that there will be time for questions at the end, and these can be submitted at any point during Ben's talk by entering this into your browser, sli.do, sli.do, and entering the event code #PoliceTaser, POLICETA is here. And now it is with great pleasure that I hand you over to Ben. Take it away, Ben.
Thanks very much, Jyoti. Thanks for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. I'm going to try and share my screen. Great. Okay. So, yeah, as Jyoti said, we're going to be talking today about a research project I recently completed, a collaborative project with people from all the universities you can see on this screen. And we called it the Taser and Social, Ethnic and Racial Disparities Research Programme, or TASERD. I think we might have fitted the name to the acronym there. This is very much a collaborative effort. Here's the research team. I should say that several people on this team did way more work on this project than I did. I'm just acting as a figurehead for the team for today's presentation. And this was a research project that was sponsored by the National Police Chiefs Council, NPCC, and MOPAT, Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime in London, and run in conjunction with the College of Policing. So it's a very collaborative effort, as will become clear as we go through the presentation. I should also say right at the beginning, just to mention our thanks to everyone who contributed data to this project, of whom there were many people involved in doing so. And that includes the 15 police forces that contribute data and other forms, quantitative data and other forms of data to the project, again, some of which we're going to be talking about as we go through the presentation. So I'm going to start with the basics. What is Taser? For those who may not be familiar with this. So Taser is the brand name, the conducted energy device that's approved by the Home Office, by the UK Home Office, for use by UK police forces. And what it basically does is it fires an electrical current that temporarily incapacitates the person who's targeted by the weapon. For those who are not familiar with UK policing, I don't know where you are in the world listening to this, UK policing is relatively, I should say British policing, is relatively unusual in global terms, is that in the British police officers operate largely unarmed. I think only about 15% of British police officers have licenses to carry firearms. Many who have a license won't carry a gun in their everyday work, and most officers go through their entire career with never having or firing a firearm. So Taser is one of the force options that are available to this largely unarmed police organisation. Other options include, of course, kind of physical restraint, getting hands-on with someone, use of batons, parva spray, or sometimes known as pepper spray. But today we're just talking about Taser. And Taser in the UK context is only used by officers who've received specialised training. So again, not all police officers carry Taser at the present point in time. And its intention is to be used to deal with people who are preventing violence or danger, people who are a danger to themselves or others, within a particular context. And crucially, and this will be a theme that comes up time and time again in this presentation, Taser allows officers to keep a distance from individuals who may be threatening or risky in some way. Taser was first introduced in the UK in 2003, and when it was first introduced, it was only carried by firearms officers. And the idea being to give those officers another use of force option that sat below somehow a firearm or a gun. It was made available to non-firearms officers who received the training first in 2008. And this had key implications in terms of command and control, kind of the way the weapon is used in British policing. It moved out of the very tightly controlled firearms context into like the much more everyday, mundane kind of interactions that police have with people right across the country. As you can see in this slide, I've got some more data in a second. We have around 30,000, 32, 33,000 incidents involving Taser in England and Wales each year. That number's been fairly constant in recent years. And again, more recently into 2022, Taser has been extended again to special constables and volunteer police officers, and they're now able to receive the training and use Taser as they go about their business. As I say, around 30,000 uses of Taser each year. Another really important point, and we'll come back to this time and time again as well, is only around 10% of these usages involve discharge of the weapon. So mostly when Taser is used by the police, it's drawn, it's pointed, aimed, people are red dotted, so that there's a laser sight on the weapon and the officer can paint the laser sight on the subject. And only it can be arced. They fire the electrical charge, it makes a noise without aiming to stun the subject. And like only in 10% of cases, so about 3,000 or 4,000 a year, is the weapon actually discharged, and then the officer attempts to stun the person involved. Absolutely crucial, and the point of today's presentation, why we conducted this research. Home Office statistics here for 22-23, but Home Office statistics over many years have shown that Black people are currently around 6 times more likely than white people to experience Taser being drawn on them or discharged. Black people are around 6 times more likely to have Taser used against them by the police. Overall, Black people are around 3 or 4 times more likely to have force used against them, any use of force against them, than white people. And these kinds of numbers fit very well with what we know about other racial and ethnic disproportionalities in police activity. So Black people are between 4 and 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. So a key point kind of framing today's discussion is that while Taser may be effective tactically and may be a good way for police to control situations, we'll see more evidence on this as we go through the presentation, this disproportionality, and particularly deaths and serious injuries that have occurred in the aftermath of the use of Tasers, pose kind of individual and cumulative threats to police legitimacy. The use of this weapon and the police use of force in general, in as much as it's disproportionate, threatens the legitimacy of the police within those communities that are affected by the disproportionate use of these tactics, these powers, and these weapons. And this is the kind of key point and the kind of in for the research I'm talking about today. So you may be asking what drives this ethnic disproportionality in police use of Taser and it end in policing more likely. I could have put more things on this slide, but there are at least 4 possibilities here, I think. The first is overt racism within the police. So in other words, police officers deliberately targeting people from specific ethnic or racial minority groups because they hold racist beliefs or motivations towards people from those groups. Now that must be true to some extent, because there must be some racists in the police, as there are racists in all walks of life. But in a sense, I think the problem is too big to be explained merely by individual level racism. There must be other factors in play to explain the level of ethnic and racial disproportionality we observe in police activity. And this is really where the term institutional racism comes in. It's a key way of understanding what might be going on here. It's a contested term, no real clear definition. Some people will give you definitions, different definitions of what we mean by institutional racism. But this here is the definition from the Macpherson report into the Stephen Lawrence murder inquiry. And I think this remains one of the best definitions, the one we're kind of working to within this context. So according to Macpherson, institutional racism is the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behaviour which amount to discrimination from unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racial stereotyping. So some of the key ways that institutional racism can express itself, we can see it in this case in police activity, can be in unaddressed, often undiscussed implicit bias and stereotyping on the part of, in our case, police officers. But it can also be seen in organisational practices and priorities. And I think the word thoughtlessness is quite important here. So various things the police do, some of which we will see later on, result in ethnic disproportionality in the application and the experience of police powers and tactics. And it's only very recently really that police have really been trying to do something about this. And they haven't, in the past and until quite recently, just given enough thought to the implications of what they're doing at organisational and institutional levels. Alongside institutional racism, we also need to think about structural racism in British society, wider patterns of marginalisation and deprivation. So here we're talking about, for example, the geographical patterning of different ethnic and racial groups across society. So as we'll see later on, Black people are more likely to live in more deprived areas which have higher levels of crime. Police are more active in those areas. That means people are living in those areas are more exposed to police activity, in some senses, regardless of what they might be doing as individuals. And fourth and finally, we should also consider variation in salient behaviours across different groups whom the police encounter. Again, this must be true to some extent, but it's really important to note at the outset that there's very little evidence of significant and consistent variation, ethnic or racial variation in patterns of offending. So all the evidence we have suggests that actually offending is pretty common, pretty equal, pretty consistent across different groups in society. So it isn't offending behaviours within the Black population that's attracting police in some way. That really probably isn't what's going on here. So within this context, and within the fact that this research was funded by the MPCC and MOPAC in conjunction with the College of Policing, we were set two broad research questions. We had input into these questions. They weren't just kind of given to us by fiat. We're interested first in whether racial disparities in TASER can be explained by patterns in police demand, intersecting with the characteristics of local areas. That's really saying something about where police are active, why they're active, who lives in those kinds of areas. And second, can racial disparities in TASER be explained by the factors at play during use of force incidents, the characteristics of the subject, the characteristics of the officers, the way the officers react to the people who they confront, and so on. We weren't asked in this report to produce recommendations, to produce specific recommendations. This was a report that was going to be fed in to wider work that's being conducted by the MPCC and college around these kinds of issues. But our work has some fairly obvious implications, which I'll come back to as we go through the presentation, and which I'll try and sum up at the end. So we did kind of end up with some recommendations at the end, just kind of despite our efforts to avoid that. But three strands to the project: project management, which I'm going to talk about today, and broadly speaking, a qualitative and a quantitative strand. So in the qualitative strand, we did interviews with specially trained officers, the STOs, the officers who are carrying TASER as they go about their work. We conducted observations, particularly of the training they receive. We tried to do some analysis of body-worn video. We talked to people from public scrutiny panels who kind of have some oversight of police use of TASER. And particularly importantly, we talked to people from affected communities, from communities that are particularly affected by police use of TASER. And then in the quantitative strand, we analysed routinely collected police data. And central to this strand of work, and I'll come back into this later, is the use of force forms officers have to fill in after each and every use of force they undertake during their work. So over the next kind of 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to draw out some of the findings from the qualitative and quantitative strand, which hopefully kind of knit together to present some kind of story about what's going on here, and offer us some insights into why we observe the level of racial and ethnic disproportionality in this use of this weapon that we do. So we'll look first at the affected community voices, the voices of people from communities who are particularly affected by this form of policing, by the use of this weapon, and by many other forms of policing as well. So we conducted over 30 interviews with people mainly from non-white minority ethnic backgrounds who had either experienced some form of TASER use themselves, been present at an incident where TASER was used, had family members who'd had TASER used against them, including people who had family members who died after the police had used Taser, and the people who represented these communities tried to articulate the impacts of Taser within minoritized communities, with England and Wales. I should say this research was limited to England and Wales, so we're not talking about the whole of the UK here. People in these focus groups were well able to reflect both on Taser itself and the extent to which it really integrates and fits in wider patterns of police discrimination and perhaps institutional racism. So as what participant 20 is reflecting on here, the statistics, the Taser use statistics, are just nothing new for us. We've been saying this for years before Taser. We've been saying with stop and search, we've been saying with the brutality of arrest. People should stop acting like it's starting to happen. We can start getting down to the real question. Why do they think they can commit these atrocities against Black people? So Taser is being experienced within a wider context of ethnic and racial disproportionalities within policing, and a very keen awareness of those disproportionalities within the affected communities. People in these interviews also talked about the lack of accountability, how difficult it is to hold the police accountable for some of these incidents, particularly, for example, in the time things take to process through the system. So as this participant is reflecting on here, when the police do things, the results are instant. Obviously, when they use Taser, the results are instant. So the damage that's done is instant. So people want the same things from policing. They want a sense of accountability that's quick, that's speedy, but they don't see it. They don't get that sense of accountability. And so there's no trust and confidence between the community and the police as a result. People in this strand of work were also well able to think about the intersections between race and, for example, age, area, mental health, and how these things come together to shape the way that police may interact, may treat people from minoritized communities. So here we have a quote from a family member of Oladaji Omishaw, who you may remember was the Black man who was tased on Chelsea Bridge, unsuccessfully tased. It didn't stun him. He jumped off the bridge and then subsequently drowned in the Thames. And his family member here is saying, to speak to his case a little bit, there's a perception of this big Black man. There's no other way to subdue other than to use Taser. It speaks to how othered Black bodies have become. So when you're confronted with one, you as a police officer, you kind of go to fight or flight mode. Black people aren't being given the compassion that potentially other people might be able to receive. And this link between Taser and mental health is something we'll come back to time and time again during the report. There's also, and as we'll see, a significant difference in the way that people in these focus groups, and actually more widely, I think, see Taser and the way it's seen within policing. So people from outside policing see Taser as a high use of force. It looks like a gun, it is a gun. People have died in the aftermath of Taser incidents. It's quite a brutal thing to be shot in this kind of way. As we'll see within policing, police see it as a low-level use of force, partly because of this sense of distance that I've already mentioned. And this chasm between police and public views of this is kind of feeding into some of the problems that exist around the use of this weapon. And overall, it's very clear from these qualitative interviews that the use of Taser is driving a wedge, or driving even more further, a wedge between police and these affected communities. We turn now to the police use of Taser from the perspective of police officers who carry and use the weapon. I'm not going to go through everything we did in this strand of work, but there's too much. I'm just going to try and draw out some of the key points. We first here conducted observations of Taser training, the training that allows officers to carry STOs, to carry Taser out on the streets. Attended training courses which delivered training for 7 police forces across England and Wales. We observed the training, we talked to the people being trained, we talked to the trainers, etc. Important to note that our observations were conducted after a recent review of Taser training, so the courses had new material recently injected into them. How does the training work? Well, there's an initial training period. This is all standardised by the College of Policing that provides the standardised training material for policing across a whole range of different areas. There's the initial training. There's a minimum of 18 hours or 3 days. That's what qualifies you as a police officer to carry Taser. Once you have that qualification, you have to undertake a refresher course every year, which is a minimum of 6 hours or 1 day. Both courses have the same components. It's a classroom-based, so there are classroom-based sessions, broadly speaking theory. There are practical weapons handling, broadly speaking, can you fire it? And there is assessments, a written knowledge check, qualification shoots, and live role-play scenarios. So a couple of the key things we took out of observing the training was first a lack of time. So this in part related to the newly mandated content, which had expanded in results of as a result. There was more content in the courses, but there hadn't been more time allocated to the courses. So this meant trainers found it very difficult to balance, for example, the classroom-based content against their requirement to teach the practical skills of how to actually fire the taser. There was a lot being squashed into a little amount of time, and it was all quite unsatisfactory from the perspective of many of the people involved, not least. It's also fairly clear to us that there are significant missed opportunities in the way that the training was calibrated. It didn't leave much space, for example, for critical reflection within the classroom sessions on some of the thorny issues that exist around Taser, for example, disproportionality. The disproportionality inputs themselves focused on national statistics, not local contexts. And like everyone else, police officers want to know about what's going on in their areas, how this affects their work, whether their force is disproportionate, and why that might be. There was also very limited discussions on what you might expect to be core issues in the training of the use of a weapon. Questions of vulnerability, questions of mental health, questions of de-escalation and human rights as they surround the way that police use weapons. There wasn't much in the training on these really important issues. If we come into the kind of practical weapons handling, and the key point here is this is a training course to use the weapon. So it was all focused around use of the weapon. And surprisingly, so the officers were being tested to see whether they were competent and confident handlers of Taser, particularly under conditions of high quality flows. There's a lot going on. They're having to make active risk assessments. There may be people shouting, the kind of situations that police officers confront as they go about their work. Within the training, Taser was promoted as a kind of if not the primary tactical option in conditions of risk, threat, and stress. In other words, officers were taught that in a situation that seems risky, where there is threat to you or threat to other people, where there's a lot going on, if people aren't obeying or verbal commands, you can in a sense go straight to the Taser because it's a low risk use for you. You maintain that distance. You don't have to get close to someone who, for example, has a weapon or you believe may have a weapon. The whole point of the training was to teach candidates how to be able to safely control subjects with the Taser. It was seen as a method or a tool for controlling situations and one you could reach for relatively quickly within a particular context. And candidates were also taught how to retrospectively justify and defend the use of Taser, not least of which because they have to fill in these use of force forms after each usage, and that includes each usage, merely drawing, pointing, and so on. When it came to the assessment, here again, there seemed to be some issues. I mean, the assessment of the classroom material, the theory was basically seemed very difficult to fail multiple choice kind of responses. The qualification shoots were a kind of a pass-fail issue. The trainers wanted to see whether the officer had the technical ability to fire the weapon. If they didn't, they weren't going to pass. That also seemed relatively simple and straightforward. By contrast, the scenarios seem much more difficult, both for the trainers, for the trainees, and as people, and as us looking in from the outside as researchers. This is partly to do because they're trying to tap into the kind of subjective assessments officers may be making in potentially high risk, confusing and difficult situations when their perception is key. And it's difficult, of course, to put yourself inside someone else's head and see the risks in the same way that that person might be doing it. But perhaps more problematically, the scenarios, the kind of culmination of all this training, were all calibrated around use of the Taser. And as the trainer here is reflecting on this quote, that's kind of inevitable because the training is training them to use a Taser. So the scenarios have to be a check on whether the officer can use the Taser appropriately. But this meant the scenarios all pushed the trained officers towards using the Taser. There wasn't much in terms of de-escalation. There weren't many, if any, scenarios where the correct answer was to not use the Taser. The correct answer was always use the Taser to control the situation. So throughout the training, officers were being pushed towards use of the Taser. Keep getting that wrong. They were pushed towards controlling situations with a weapon that they were being taught was relatively low risk for themselves and others, in stark contrast to what we saw when we talked to people from the communities affected by the use of Taser. If we turn to the wider set of observations and interviews we did with police officers outside of training scenarios, we talked to 89 officers, most of whom were STOs, most of whom carried Taser, but in a comprehensive variety of roles, some of them in managerial roles, who wouldn't have been doing street-based policing. And within this sample, most officers were very clear on the benefits of Taser, and they often described it as a tool, not a weapon, precisely a tool to control situations. They stressed the extent to which firing it was very rare, and the extent to which it was valuable as a visual deterrent. That's not the best picture here, but that shows how most officers wear their Taser. They don't carry it on their belt because they've got a lot of other equipment on their belt. They carry it on their front. It's very visible. It looks like a gun. It's got that bright yellow handle. And many officers talked about the extent to which even just turning up with this might lower the tone, lower the pressure of a particular situation. They talked about the versatility of the use and the power of the red dot challenge. In other words, if you paint the laser sight on someone, often again, that's enough to de-escalate the situation or at least control the situation. That might be a better way of putting it. And they saw it as something often powerful protection to themselves and to others precisely because of this notion of distance, precisely because it allowed them to keep a distance between themselves and someone who may be presenting a risk. And they saw it as a fast track resolution where its verbal instructions were proved ineffective. It was a way of gaining very quick control over otherwise dangerous situations. Officers were also well able to think about some of the drawbacks inherent in the use of these weapons. They talked about some situations, some characteristics of the people they're dealing with, which preclude the use of Taser. And they also talked about the extent to which it isn't always effective, even sometimes discharging it isn't effective in stunning someone. So it's not a perfect tool in that sense, or weapon, I would rather say. They talked about the extent to which Taser can accentuate difficulties when dealing with vulnerable people. So not everyone reacts to it in the same way, and some people are in an agitated state. Perhaps someone going through a mental health crisis may react very negatively to the sight and the potential use of something, again, that looks very much like a gun to someone not familiar with it. And other officers were also able to talk about an objective tension between Taser and the way that Taser might be used to control situations and their community-focused roles, which were all about building relationships and bridges with communities. And they were able to see these things sat in some tension with each other. It's also clear through the interviews that above and beyond the way that individual officers may think about and use Taser, it's also important to see it as an institutionalized response. So for example, what do we mean with that? So for example, officers would talk about how risk management in call centers pushes towards Taser deployments. In other words, if you're in the call center, taking a call about a situation that, for example, where a weapon might be present, and you have a choice between sending a Taser trained armed officer and a non-Taser armed officer, you're going to go for the Taser armed officer. So you have Taser armed officers being continually kind of inserted into situations where the use of this weapon may be more likely because of its presence, whereas in other cases where Taser armed officers might not have been present, that situation would have been dealt with in different ways and possibly more de-escalatory ways. It's also clear that STOs were being deployed towards force priorities in a number of other ways, which would suggest that Taser is going to be increasingly inserted into situations that make its use more likely, and particularly make its use more likely in areas with, for example, large minority populations. So, for example, many forces in our sample, many forces across England and Wales, have what they call some kind of impact areas or hotspots of crime, and where they expend significant amounts of resources, and sometimes it's where they target resources. And these often tend to be ethnically diverse neighbourhoods because they correlate very strongly with deprivation. Often specialised teams are going to bring high intensity policing into these areas. They're going to be doing proactive policing. They might be doing a lot of stop and search, for example. They're being told to go to these places. They're being told these places are dangerous. They're being told to be proactive in those areas. If they have Taser, again, that makes the use of Taser in these kinds of places more likely. On top of this, attention and activity in these kinds of locations, particularly in kind of inner city areas, are often directed towards ethnically diverse organised crime groups, OCGs, through the kind of daily intelligence packages and briefings the officers receive. So they're being told to go into areas, that these areas are dangerous, These areas have large minority populations. They're being told to do proactive policing in there, and often they're being primed to look for people from specific minority groups. And some officers were able to see, well, it's kind of, as the quote here says, it's almost like the disproportionality is what drops out the other end of this process. And that could be disproportionality in a number of aspects of policing, for example, stop and search. It could also be disproportionality in the use of taser. If you send officers with tasers into these kinds of areas, with these kinds of characteristics, with these briefings, they just seem much more likely to use taser as a result. We also asked officers to account for the disproportionality. So what did they think about why we might be observing this disproportionality in the experience or in the use of taser? Interestingly, and probably quite tellingly, ethnic minority officers were well able to believe that this is a result, usually in some form of institutional racism. And many of these officers were able themselves to recount personal experiences of police discrimination and institutional racism when, for example, they've been stopped and searched by colleagues. But the dominant perspective was that of white officers, who were the dominant group within the sample, because the vast majority of police officers in England and Wales are white. And here the response was something much more akin to kind of denial, or at least neutralisation. And officers in this group would stress that the use of taser, the use of force in policing more widely, is about levels of risk, not race. For them, taser is all about risk. We're not policing people because they're from particular racial or ethnic groups. We're policing them because they present different levels of risk to us. And if disproportionality, in a sense, again, falls out at the end of that, that's not really our fault. We're just responding to whatever happens to be confronting us within a particular content. Having said that, and that's kind of, I think, slightly disappointing, but having said that, several officers were able to offer quite a sophisticated explanation of what might be going on here, which is something akin to what I was just saying. So they saw disproportionality as emergent from a whole set of processes that involved a combination of demand on policing, generated, for example, by crime, area deprivation and the kind of structural racism that means that people from minority groups are more likely to live in more deprived areas, the way the police respond to different types of crime. They were able to see that these things come together in some way to produce, or to at least to underpin some of that disproportionality. We turn to the quantitative element of the project now, and this is analysis primarily of these use of force forms that the police record after each use of force, including each use of taser. Now, when we embarked on this project, we had some quite ambitious kind of plans for what we could do with the quantitative data. I'm just going to briefly describe what they are, and then just briefly describe what we were able to do, because there's a big problem, a big gap here. What we wanted to do was create a single kind of database that linked these use of force forms with other information the police hold about incidents, other information about the officers involved, information about misconduct, information about complaints. And we want to do that at an area level, so we could bring in data from the census, the characteristics of the areas in which the police are operating, to really try and understand disproportionality at the neighbourhood level. Really try and understand why it is that police are more active in some areas, if indeed they are, what are the characteristics of those areas and the people who live there, and what that might have to say about the problem of disproportionality. But what we found is ultimately we couldn't do this in almost all cases. There were very significant problems with where the police collate, retain, and reproduce the data that massively limited these areas of the project. So there's very limited integration across all the various databases that police hold, which means that those databases don't necessarily speak, and often usually don't speak, to the use of force forms. There are problems with data infrastructure and extraction. Often forces just weren't able to give us data in a usable format. Actually, the information on the use of force forms varied from force to force, which limited our ability to conduct kind of comparative analysis across different forces. And perhaps most crucially of all, most fundamentally, many forces were missing geographical identifiers in the use of force forms, so they weren't keeping a record of where use of force was taking place within their force area. So we weren't able to do all the things we wanted to do with the quantitative data. So what we ended up doing was something quite simple, basically, fundamentally just looking at the use of force forms and trying to distinguish between the use of taser and other uses of force. Important to note here that other uses of force usually means compliant handcuffing when the subject is not resistant, or non-compliant handcuffing when the subject isn't resisting. They form the bulk of use of force incidents. And just at a very kind of high level, we're interested in knowing, is there a statistical association between ethnicity and taser use compared to other use of force modalities across the different forces that were able to contribute data to us? And second, can any association between ethnicity and taser be explained by other factors? Or to put it another way, does any such association persist between taser and ethnicity, even after we control for demographic, situational, and other variables? And what we found at the bivariate level, looking at these use of force forms, was if the subject was from a Black or mixed ethnic group, this increased the odds of taser being used in comparison to some other use of force modality, usually again, compliant or non-compliant handcuffing, but not always. But in multivariate models, this association tended to disappear. What were important were what police call impact factors, so factors that may impact the way the officer is responding to a situation, characteristics of the subject and or of the event. And this means things like prior knowledge. So whether the police had prior knowledge of an individual, whether they encountered him or her before, was important in predicting whether taser was going to be used. A kind of a mix of gender, size, build, and more to say about that in a minute. Obviously, where there was a weapon present, taser was more likely to be used if a weapon was present in that encounter. Also mental health, which is a separate kind of category, but it was very important in understanding where and how taser gets used. And when you took these factors into account, in almost all cases, the link between ethnicity and taser use was broken. These factors accounted for that, if you like. Some forces, fortunately, were able to give us more data that allowed more subtle analysis. And one of these forces was Greater Manchester Police. So we did kind of a deep dive on the more kind of the more sophisticated data they were able to send us. And we did 3 pieces of analysis here, which I think are really, really telling and really get to the core of what might be going on here. So data for Greater Manchester suggested that impact factors, particularly prior knowledge and gender, size, build, mediated the baseline association between ethnicity and taser use. In other words, we have some evidence to suggest that one reason why Black people are more likely to be tasered is because they're more likely to be coded by police as being male, having a large size, being more threatening. That seems pretty clear evidence to me of some level of implicit bias going on there. We also found that gender and ethnic match had a de-escalatory effect. So the GMP, Greater Manchester Police, were able to divide characteristics of the officers within the situation. And we found that officers were less likely to tase people who shared their ethnicity or shared their gender. Given most police officers are white, the implications of that are fairly clear, I think. We also, interestingly, and again, possibly really importantly, found there were significant variations in the use of taser across different parts of the force that couldn't be explained by incident characteristics. Some areas of GMP, high-level areas, command units, if you like, were more likely to use taser compared to other uses of force. Other areas were less likely to use taser compared to other uses of force. So again, we see this pattern replicated in lots of other areas of policing. There's significant cultural variation within and across police forces in the way that, in this case, taser is being used. Another force that supplied us with more detailed data was Hampshire Police, and they were one of the only forces that supplied us with data where the uses of taser could be located in the geographical areas in which the encounter happened. So we were able to use a lower super output area, the census-based classification. The super output areas are quite small, have an average population of about 1,500. So we were looking at the patterning of taser use and other characteristics of those areas across Hampshire. And what we found is that the use of taser broadly follows Pareto principle. So around between 70 and 80% of the taser incidents were happening in between 10 and 20% of areas. And this is reflected in other forms of police activity as well, for example, stop and search. These areas where taser and other forms of police activity were more likely tended to be more ethnically diverse. They tended to be more deprived. They tended to have high levels of mental ill health, and they tended to have high levels of crime. And crucially, Black people living in Hampshire were more likely to live in those kinds of areas. So Black people living in Hampshire were more likely to live in higher areas with high levels of stop and search, greater deprivation, worse mental health, higher levels of crime. So they're more likely to be exposed to police activity in general, and partly as a consequence of that, to taser use in particular, because you're only going to get taser use where there are officers. So we've got clear evidence here where the kind of social and geographical patterning across different groups in society, or of different groups in society, kind of predisposes or makes members of those groups more available to police. They're more likely to encounter police, and possibly, in some senses, more likely to experience police use of these weapons in general. So just coming to the end here, to conclude, what do I think that we've kind of learned from this project? Was very, very clear at the outset that within some ethnic minority communities, those particularly affected by the police use taser and many other forms of policing as well, taser is seen as a high-level use of force in a context of kind of disempowerment in relation to police, in a context of widespread awareness and experience of other disproportionalities within policing, experiences of various forms of racism, and experience of a police force that has not been accountable for this disproportionality, for the racism implicit in what they've been doing. You compare and contrast that with taser increasingly being seen as an institutional or a favoured institutional response to specific types of risk, most obviously weapon, but also involving perhaps mental health incidents, and a kind of a go-to device in the context of a hierarchy of harms, and particularly the kinds of ways that police officers try to control situations. And within those kinds of contexts, officer explanations, kind of police explanations for disproportionality, revolved less around kind of psychological bias and related more to a combination of demand, area deprivation, the way that police are tasked, the way that they are deployed within particular areas. So this is this kind of fundamental mismatch between how police use taser and how effective communities use taser. And the legitimacy challenge for the police exists within that contrast, within that mismatch, if you like. To return to our original research questions, we found evidence that the disproportionality in taser use is caused both by unconscious biases within the way that police, or in the way that police are responding to incidents, and the fact that policing is concentrated into areas, and particularly urban deprivation, which are more likely to have higher, more likely to be ethnically diverse, and therefore people who are living in those areas, these ethnically diverse populations, are more exposed to these forms of policing. That said, all our kind of conclusions across all this need to be very sensitive, because the quality of the police recorded data was so poor that it's hard to draw firm and fast conclusions from the work we're able to do. Having said that, I think it's very clear that the extent to which disproportionality in taser use, as in many other areas of policing, what's been really interesting with the project is how closely taser use maps onto other areas of disproportionality in policing, most obviously stop and search. But taser use is a wicked problem. It's a result of multiple causal processes operating at individual, organisational, institutional, and societal levels. And unpicking that Gordian knot is likely to be extremely difficult. Just to conclude with the kind of our quote-unquote recommendations, I mean, I think it should be fairly clear that these are in a sense flowing from what I've been saying. So we were quite critical, I think, of the training. We would like to see improvements made to the training. This seems to be one area that the police should focus on, both in terms of the time given it to it, the infrastructure around it, and the content of the taser, which is calibrated in such a way as to pull police towards the use of taser so trainers can assess handling. There needs to be more focus on de-escalation. There needs to be more focus on the kinds of problems we've been talking about today and what the police might be able to do to kind of minimise or lessen those problems. And there needs to be more critical consideration built in, so the kind of local experiences of police are able to tie, enables them to tie some of this to their own practice. Having said all that, I think it would be unfair to focus purely on officers here. There's much bigger problems that need to be addressed. Final recommendation is that we need to improve the quality and accessibility of routine data so we can answer lots of the questions that remain unanswered from this piece of work and from this presentation. And I will finish there. Thank you, Jyoti.
Thank you, Ben. That was fascinating, and that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions on Slido, so I'll start with those. But those who want to put in more questions, please type in sli.do in your browser, and the event code is #PoliceTaser. Right. So I've got a question which says, should police be prevented from using Taser?
That's a good question. Not at this point in time, and not in terms of an absolute fiat. So we need to stop use of this weapon. I think we need to take seriously the extent to which officers see it as a positive way of controlling dangerous situations within a context where they don't have some of the tools widely available. So other police forces around the world may be far up to control the situations, and we need to keep hold of the unarmed nature of British policing. Having said that, I'm quite a big fan of kind of David Lammy's kind of explain or reform idea, which in this context would mean something along the lines of, well, if use of Taser continues to be ethnically disproportionate, and police and others around policing can't explain that to our collective satisfaction, then changes need to be instituted, because we can't carry on. We can't keep just carrying on with forms of policing that produce these disproportionate outcomes. Something needs to be done about it. So I think the onus on policing, and in that broadly, so the police and the number of organisations sit around police, the onus is on them to come up with ways of doing this better, frankly. And if they can't do it better, then perhaps we do need to start having conversations about minimising or removing the use of this weapon. Because how else are we going to bring about change? You're on mute, Josie.
Sorry, I have another question. Why have forces often proven to be reluctant to confront the issue of ethnic disproportionality? We found when we were doing this research and we asked police officers, they absolutely denied that there is any ethnic disproportionality. And they just said that's just a factor of how we operate. What's your explanation, you think, for why they're so defensive?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. I think there are multiple answers to that question. Mm-hmm. I think in the past, and by the past I mean 20, 30 years ago, there would have been just that base denial. This is not a problem. This is not something we need to worry about. If I accept it, if I, as a police officer speaking at that time, accept that there is disproportionality, then that's just a fact of different offending behaviour and so forth. I don't think we're quite in that situation now. I think there is a wider awareness within policing that these problems are real and that police are implicated within them. So this is in some senses something the police are doing, notwithstanding the fact that there are all these other kind of wider social, structural, economic processes and pressures sitting behind them. But at the kind of level of the individual officer, I think often there's a difficulty in seeing how their own practice, which from their own perspective is not disproportionate, because, for example, they're confronting risk, not race, and they're very clear that that's what they're doing, and that may very well be what they're doing. It takes quite a leap, I think, for individuals to go from that, well, my practice is fine, I can see what my colleagues are doing, we're not doing what you say, to accepting that at the organisational level, at the institutional level, we are producing these patterns of disproportionality. And that's why police organisations are kind of grappled with the concept of institutional racism, which they can often continue to see, not always as growing exceptions of it, but many police organisations continue to see it as a kind of an allegation about individual racism within their service, and that isn't really what it means. It means other kinds of things. And in some senses, it's kind of making that kind of conceptual leap to say, well, okay, we may not be racists, but we're producing these racist outcomes. That's hard for people to do, and that remains an ongoing job. Thankfully and positively led by some people in policing to kind of convince their colleagues that this is what's actually happening, that we can do something about it.
That sounds like a really comprehensive answer. I have another question. The reputation is a little poor, but nationwide forces insist it's a good tool or resource. Well, what's the truth? I think the data is telling the truth, but would you like to sort of say what's the truth about disproportionality?
There is an ongoing debate within policing about what this word means, which I kind of skipped over because it kind of gets a bit complicated for a 40-minute presentation. I mean, from my perspective, disproportionality only makes sense if you're at the population level, if you're comparing. So you know, if 20, and these are not the right numbers because I can't remember the right numbers, but if 20% of the people that police are tasing are black, but only 10% of the population they're policing is black, that means that it's disproportionate, because that's the only real way we can have any kind of certainty about what's going on here. And that's particularly, of course, within a context where we know that there isn't meaningful ethnic variation within levels of offending. The difficulty comes again when you kind of translate that down to individual interactions. So often when police are talking about disproportionality, they're thinking about in a legal sense, is my response to this incident proportionate to the threat that I'm facing? And from their perspective, it is, right? Because I think this guy's got a knife. I need to control the situation. This is a good way for me to control the situation. I don't need to get close to him. It's with relatively low risk for everyone involved. And again, it's that leap from that to be able to see that, well, your use of Taser in this context may be proportionate, but you can still produce these disproportionate outcomes at the population level. And we can have a very similar conversation about stop and search or arrest rates. It is basically the same kind of thing going on across all these different areas of policing.
And I think, as you said, that part of this disproportionality may be made, but part of it might be just a result of wider structural factors that nobody can really control. It would be disproportionate, but can be explained because of other reasons, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, and what I think one of the interesting and important things to say about that is the clear implication of this is that, in a sense, we're all implicated in the disproportionality of policing. But it's not just a problem of police. It might conceivably be not primarily a problem of police. It might primarily be a problem of these wider social economic forces, political forces that, for example, have resulted in kind of the concentration of particular groups within the most deprived areas of particularly of our cities, and kind of what goes on in those places. Now that's a kind of societal failure in many respects that the police are having to, in a sense, deal with, which is not to let them off the hook, because clearly what they're doing is important. But I think, you know, the solution to these kinds of problems can't be just left to the police, because they are much bigger than that in some senses.
And then there's another question which says, do you think there are ways to improve the data that's collected by police? Do police forces perhaps see data collection as a tick box or a negative task, or just something they're going through the motions for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in this case, while there will inevitably be problems with data collection at the individual level, in other words, the officers filling in the forms, those problems we can deal with those problems, because those problems will usually relate to missing data of some kind. We've got ways of dealing with missing data. The bigger problem is the way that the force, as I said, the way the forces collate and retain that information. And most forces that we encountered here, most forces I'm aware of, are some way away from allowing anyone to produce the kind of all singing, all dancing data set that we wanted to produce for this project, and which we would have needed to produce to meaningfully answer most of the questions that we'd been set. So it just remains the case that most police databases don't talk to each other. So the use of force forms aren't linked to the incident forms, which aren't linked to other forms that are connected. So you can't join them all together. And again, I think change is underfoot here, underway rather. But we're yet to see the outcomes of those changes, certainly from a research perspective. We haven't yet seen much, if anything, about the way that these data sets can be joined together in meaningful ways. So yeah, there's loads to be done in this area.
I have a question for you, which is to do with training and with the recommendation for improved training. And we all know, anyone who's researched the police knows that any problem with the police, one of the solutions always is more training, better training. And in fact, in this case, we know exactly what kind of training, and the fact that the training content is not a question, it's the time and the resources required. And we do know that there's a genuine issue with resourcing and abstraction with training everywhere in the world. How do we resolve this problem where we can see very clearly there is a need for additional training, but the police forces have their very real problems of not being able to afford that time for training? How do forces resolve that?
Yeah, another good question. I think part of it has to come down with two questions of priorities. And I think TASER makes that very clear. So the most serious thing that a police officer can do is use force against someone. That's that's in some senses their raison d'etre, but it is the most serious and most important thing that they do. And they should be training their officers appropriately to do that. And if they feel that they haven't got the resources to do that, they should think about reallocating resources, not just leaving the training in the kind of current situation that it is. And of course, that's easier said than done. It's easy enough for someone like me to say, I'm not having to make those resource allocation decisions. But at some level, that has to be what happens here. And I think that kind of sets apart weapons training, use of force training more broadly from some other forms of training that we could be talking about, where these issues are actually even more severe in some senses. They just have to decide to do it. And that has to be within a context where this is the most serious thing you do. People do die as a result of Taser being used, but not directly as a result, but in the aftermath of Taser incidents, as we saw. People see it in the ways that they do. You need to make sure that your officers, when they use it, are the best trained they can possibly be, because it's so serious. And we would hope that that training done like that could also feed into dealing with the disproportionality as well, because it's clear that some of that disproportionality is coming from the ways that officers are responding to situations that confront them. And you would hope that better training would give them more tools to deal with those situations.
Thank you. I think that's a really comprehensive answer. I think we're also, that was the last of the questions. We're coming to the end of our talk. It has been a really illuminating talk. Thank you, Ben. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I just would like to remind the viewers, the next lecture on the UCL lecture series is on the 30th of May by Dominic Weiss, and he's going to speak on why Jamelia can't read or write, government failures and reading. Another fascinating topic. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much, Ben. See you all. Bye-bye.